Hi, I'm Hannah Durden and you're listening to the Outdoors Group podcast. This podcast is a call to arms to get children and young people outside again. It's your one-stop shop for all things outdoor, child, young person and education related. Thanks for tuning in. Today I'm over the moon to be joined by Sami Grover and our own Pete Morgan. Sami's an environmental writer, branding specialist and author of We're All Climate Hypocrites Now. He lives on the East Coast in America and has very kindly joined us rather early his time to be part of this. Pete's a chartered environmentalist and currently our head of operations at the Outdoors Group. Before joining our team, he was the environmental officer for Paint and Zoo, and he lives on the east side of Exeter, so hopefully he's well awake by now. They've both agreed to join me today to talk about the challenges facing the climate change movement, why big polluters love the individualist approach to solving climate change, and how to protect a society run by fossil fuels while still living in that system. So thanks for coming today, you two.
Pleasure.
And I'd love to start by asking how you found yourselves, both of you, where you are now and your background of kind of environmentalism and what's kind of led you to where you are. I don't mind who starts.
You don't mind who starts. Pete, you make the call.
I think you can do it. Go for it.
All right. So how I came to environmentalism is the question. So I have been working on climate change issues since probably before I've been working, right? So 13, 14 years old, I sort of started getting interested in environmentalism, started attending protests and sort of pestering my mom to start composting and that kind of thing. And through that journey, I sort of have a liberal arts education, language, and I had a real hard time sort of figuring out where I could plug into this movement until I kind of discovered that the good news is that the crisis is so all-encompassing and so vast that there's always a place you can plug in, right? So I worked in publishing, started working on environmental issues within the publishing company I worked at. And then at some point, I decided that I was flying a fair amount in that publishing company, and I decided I couldn't really justify that flying. So I vowed never to fly again. I had one last flight to take, and then promptly fell in love with an American woman on that last business trip. And I've been living in North Carolina and flying regularly and feeling terrible about it ever since. So that's kind of my journey to the topic, and Pete and I go way back, so we worked together on some environmental stuff, on sort of voluntary environmental stuff while I was in England working in publishing. I'll kick it over to you, Pete, and sort of let you introduce your journey.
Mine's a little bit different, I suppose. So I suppose I've always liked the outdoors. So my family were, big into sailing, and then my dad got quite into sort of, so the outdoor pursuit stuff when he sort of like started to, I don't know, maybe he just fell out of love with that a little bit. But I always did engineering, so I didn't really give a toss about the environment. I was never really bothered about it. And then I got involved in a project which was by an organisation called Rally International, and they had Millennium funding, and they sent 150 people from Devon and Cornwall of a whole variety mixed bag. So there was people like me that were workers that would, in normal. There was, I think there's somebody from the police force. There was myself as an engineering, some other people that were doing a whole variety of different bits and bobs. But they also got people that were students. They also got people that were homeless. They also got people that were, addicted to drugs. A few people that were, really trying to get off heroin and all this sort of stuff. And then real sort of like cross-section of society, and sent us all off to Ghana in Africa for 3.5 months. And so one of the things about that was, it was life-changing for so many people. And the point of us going out there was not only for our own self-development as a youth project, but it was also a question of then doing some good out there. And the flip side also was we had to raise money to go out there to then have to go where your local community or people have supported you, say through, donations or funding or sponsorship. Now you need to come back and do something for them. And so I did an environmental project when I was out there, and I did an environmental project when I came back with the Eden Project. And then suddenly I went, well, why on earth am I working in Plymouth with a whole bunch of people that I don't really, get on with quite as much as I feel like I should, doing something I don't necessarily believe in. And I went, well, I did this great thing, and I think environmental people were sort of like more aligned with my beliefs, and actually it's something I want to be involved in. And so I quit my job and I sent myself off to Bristol and went and studied environmental management and sustainability at the University of West England in Bristol. And that's how I got into it.
Oh, nice.
So.
Awesome. And then what was just before we move on, what was the project you guys were doing together then in Bristol?
Well, it's several different projects, right? It was part of the Bristol permaculture group. So we were involved in some community gardens in Bristol itself, and there was various people running classes and things. And then we were also quite involved with a demonstration garden at the Glastonbury Festival site. So we'd go out and camp out there and create sort of edible landscapes and a little bit of a sort of a escape spot out in the green fields where folks could get away and eat comfrey pakoras, and there might have been a pint or two of scrumpy drunk at the same time, but
more than likely.
Mostly by
and then we also did the same sort of stuff at another festival called Shambhala as well, and so that also involved not only doing like demonstration garden sort of things, but that was only for sort of like a week, whereas the Glastonbury one was a permanent one. But one thing we did do at that is we were doing sort of like workshops. So people doing stuff on sort of like seed bombs and guerrilla gardening, and lots of it. So I did stuff on straw bale, barn building, and we would just all find different topics and different things, and those were the stuff that we were doing. And some of the stuff that I was doing through the permaculture at the time, so that I was obviously doing my degree, but then my first job after my degree was working for Bristol City Council in the allotments department, and so we were incorporating lots of things about permaculture through that as well.
Yeah. Oh, awesome. Sounds really fun.
It was really good.
Really fun.
It was, yeah.
Sammy, I've watched some of your videos on YouTube while I was kind of researching for this, and I really kind of resonated with what you were saying about the kind of gas and oil industries loving this narrative that we need to be doing more in our kind of individual lives, like, eating less meat, not flying and things, and like them kind of putting this need for change with individuals rather than kind of the fossil fuel industry or kind of big carbon emitting businesses and things. Can you explain a bit more about that to those who are listening, and kind of your thoughts on it and what you've kind of found and what you've written about in that regard?
Yeah, happy to. I think the thing I'll start with is a little bit of a caveat, is that I think it's really easy when you're talking about this topic, right, to discount the value of individual action. And I'm really not trying to do that, right? If you want to eat vegan or ride a bike or, drive an electric car or whatever it is, I think there's a lot of value in that. And I do a lot of those things myself. Where it kind of goes off the rails is when that is presented as the solution.
Yeah.
And that's really where sort of BP and the like love to keep the climate debate, right? If we just kept talking about climate change in the lens of like, turn down your thermostat and ride a bike, what they know is that a small committed minority will do that, and everybody else will carry on as normal, and they'll continue to make big bucks, right? There's a reason. Some people say BP invented the carbon footprint. They did not. It was floating around long before that in academia, but they did help popularize it, right? When BP were doing their Beyond Petroleum campaign, probably around the same time that Pete and I were messing about with comfrey pakoras. They very much pushed this idea of, what is your carbon footprint? What is your carbon footprint? It was very counterintuitive at the time. I was like, why does BP want us thinking about their, how much oil we burn? And it's like, of course they do, because they know that, basically it'll be Pete, Hannah, and Sammy who worry about it, and everyone else will carry on as normal, right? So there's an element of distraction. The analogy I use is like, if you're a big employer, you would much rather negotiate pay rises with every single individual employee than you would that they form a union.
Yeah.
Right. And really, a union is the only way you're going to get decent pay rises for everybody. And climate is inherently a systemic. The climate crisis and our carbon emissions are inherently systemic, right? Particularly like if you look at where I live in the States, it's a very car-centric space. I can yell all I want at people to drive less, but honestly, like, it's a bit futile. And most people are going to want to wrap themselves in big boxes of steel because everyone else has, and it's terrifying to ride on the roads, right? So there's this element of like, you can't get we have to get to zero carbon emissions, or net zero, or whatever your favorite term is, And the only way to do that is systemic. We can tweak around the edges with individual change, but we can't shift the system without broader change. So rather than thinking about my own carbon footprint, what I like to think about is those things I do, whether it's diet or the way I move around or whatever. I like to think of them as I was going to say levers you can pull to push systemic change. Sorry, and I'm rambling a little bit on this, but I think it's important. Sometimes the analogy that's used, and I used it in the book actually, is that trying to live a perfectly green lifestyle in a ungreen system is like trying to swim upstream. I think there's actually a better analogy, which is that it's like trying to escape a riptide, right? If you know anything about riptides, you can't swim back against the stream, right? You can't do it. You're going to tire yourself out and you're going to get exhausted and then you're going to drown. But what you can do is swim to the side of the riptide. So rather than pushing people to go all out on, zero carbon living in this world, what I think we do is we find that place where I can make the biggest difference, and I put 90 to 95% of my energy there, right? And try and sort of swim perpendicular to the riptide to escape it, and then swim back to shore and help whoever's stuck in it. If you're following that analogy.
Yeah, I mean, and very similar to the sort of like the work that I was doing when I was at Paynton Zoo is that there's things that you have direct control over, and that's if that's an organization or as an individual, there's things that we immediately can do, and then the rest of it is trying to influence. And the problem about influencing is, that can only go so far, because there's a lot of people that can just put their fingers in their ears and pretend that, they don't hear anything. And I think that is one of the problems about the environmental sector is, there's you do need some big structural government change to start making these really big gains. And we've seen sort of over time that when I finished my master's most probably about 10, 12 years ago, there was a thing called the Code for Sustainable Homes that had been brought in by the then Labour government, which was basically on a track to get all homes to be built to a zero carbon principle, air tightness, amazingly well insulated. And one of the first things that the new government did was jettison that because it was red tape. Now we find ourselves, a decade later, if we had done those things, then we wouldn't have had people being arrested for, the Insulate Homes movement this year. We wouldn't find ourselves in a big crisis over gas supplies and energy supplies as a result of sort of like the war or any other sort of external measures, because lots of these things were in place. Yeah. And the people that were jumping down and protesting over that, maybe they've made a bit of a difference, maybe they haven't, but certainly the big different changes are going to come by structural changes by our government.
Right. If you don't mind, I'm going to jump in on that too. I'm going to do something I don't often do, which I'm also going to give the British Conservative government a little bit of credit, is that it's actually very interesting to look at my carbon footprint, right? Is that when I left the UK, right, in 2006, 2007, renewable energy wasn't a particularly big part of the grid in the UK. I moved over here, and I've since been doing all these things on my own personal carbon footprint. I drive an electric car. I compost. I work from home or whatever. And I'm willing to bet that my least green friends in England will have seen their carbon footprints reduced significantly more than I've achieved individually, largely because of offshore wind, right? So there has been some progress made in the UK, but nowhere near enough. And by the way, you all are burning North Carolina forests to fuel your energy, which we can talk about later. But there has been more progress made in the UK than in the US. And therefore, whatever I do in my individual life, my carbon footprint is still going to be bigger than Pete's, and he's probably going to make fun of me for it, along with my weird hybrid accent.
Well, at least you said compost instead of compost, so we're winning.
I'm really trying this morning. It's like, you don't know how hard that is for me now.
I like the correction of levers to levers earlier for us as well.
I know, he's tailoring to our market.
Yeah.
But no, you're completely right, and that's the thing. In terms of renewable energy, we are making some really big steps forward as a country, which is fantastic. But it's also part of my nature, and I think it's part of lots of environmentalists' nature to go, yeah, but we could be doing more, and to point out some of the things that were missed before. But yeah, it's and undoubtedly there's been some good stuff, but we're still not even producing enough renewable electricity, let alone taking our energy off.
Yeah.
Oh, it's hard not to just fixate, isn't it, on the missed opportunity to do this windfall tax on them recently with the energy crisis that's coming up. But that's, a whole nother debate, I guess. But it does lead me to think about the kind of, you just mentioned it, Sammy, the difference between the US and the UK. Like, for example, have you guys got energy crisis in the same way that we do coming up, or is that like a us specific thing?
Actually, not in the same way. I mean, Americans are losing their proverbial, because, or they were 2 months ago, because gas prices were, $5 a gallon. Like, translate that to liters and it's bonkers how cheap it is, right? But everybody drives further. A lot of people drive big pickup trucks to get to work. So we have a crisis. It's not in the same way. I think the proximity to Russia, the reliance on Russia, all of that is not impacting as much. That there's fracking is actually economically feasible over here right now. So it's not in the same way, but people are tracking it because it's a global commodity and it will cause issues. And but we're not worried about keeping the lights on in the same way. It would be nice if we were, to be honest, if we had a little more sort of energy literacy. But the interesting part is I do see big shifts going on in ways that aren't just about switching out fossil fuels for solar, right? Is that actually in a lot of cities there is moves towards being more bike friendly. The e-bike thing is really changing a lot of things. People are starting to conceptualize the idea of living without a car, at least in our sort of coastal elite liberal bubbles that we like to live in.
Are you in like
so
the
that's been
of America?
I'm sorry?
Are you in like the topness of America? Like
sort of, yeah. Well, it's really interesting. I live in what you'd call a purple state. So it's sort of, it's about 50-50 in terms of the electorate, Republican versus Democrat. It is always going to be a Republican state in terms of the legislature because we're not a real democracy. And within the city I live in, it's very sort of, it's a university town, so there's a lot of climate focus, but it's also, the roads are atrocious and it's scary to ride a bicycle. So it's a real interesting mix. But I do, having lived here for long enough, the idea that people don't care about the climate in the US is frustrating to me. I think that's a misconception in the UK. There's a big climate movement here. There's a really big environmental justice movement, really powerful sort of movements that connect those dots between poverty and equity and race and pollution and the systems that keep us down. So all of that is really amazing, particularly in the US South. It's just that the cards are stacked against those folks, largely by, like I alluded to, we for now will always be a Republican state, even if we vote 50-50. It's wild. So this again gets that thing of like, you can only do so much as an individual. I can't vegan my way to a democracy.
No, that's a t-shirt slogan, isn't it? Surely.
Yeah. Yeah, it should be. Yes, I'm going to work on that now.
I mean, what I would say is, from somebody on this side of the pond, I think it's quite often a bit of a narrative that goes on about, well, we seem to be doing pretty well, but it's China or it's America or it's so and so. But I just sort of like, it's worth mentioning that with the United States, they've always been quite often at the forefront of what we would consider today sort of like environmental norms. So, the national parks movement came out of America. You've got sort of like the first sort of environmental body for environmental protection came out of America. There's so much that was sort of like brought in. I think possibly even sort of like that idea of environmental impact analysis.
Yeah.
If you're going to do a project, you're going to came out of America. So, and there's been some huge, amazing forces for good that have come out of it.
I think there's certain blonde-haired buffoons that kind of take up all the noise in the space, right? So then it's you kind
I have
of
no idea who you're talking about, but yeah. it'll be interesting to see with the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, the recent climate. I know IRA has different connotations over there, but the Inflation Reduction Act is, I think, fiscally the biggest climate legislation passed by any government anywhere, I believe, right? And it's huge investment.
What it is?
So it's a large package that Biden kind of squeaked through in a 50-50 vote in the Senate, and it includes massive investment in electric vehicles, in renewable energy, in heat pumps, in electrification of homes, in it's really big. Electric school buses, like it's a sort of a shopping list of what needs to be done. It's nowhere near as big as the original. There was a bill that was going to be passed that was probably 3 times its size, and we have 1 or 2 Democratic senators that needed to get in the way, and there was some dirty deals done in terms of fossil fuel infrastructure that may or may not pass. Actually, there's developments last night. We don't want to get into that, but there's a battle going on right now over it. But overall, it will be a huge contribution to carbon reduction. They're estimating it'll take sort of projected carbon reductions in the US from something like 25% to about 41%, which is still not enough, right? And going back to what we said about the UK, it's not enough, but it is a big shift in the right direction. It's a big structural shift that will be hard to reverse. Yeah. So I'm broadly speaking excited about it, very sad about the compromises that had to be made. And there are people who are legitimately angry about there are communities that will be thrown under the bus by allowing more fossil fuel extraction in the Gulf of Mexico, etc. But overall, it will probably reduce emissions significantly.
Yeah, that's really amazing to hear. Like I've not, well, as you say, Pete, I think yeah, we point fingers a lot, right? So I wasn't aware of any of that. I mean, and it's interesting, isn't it? Because I went up to Bristol for the weekend last weekend, and they've got a e-scooter scheme that they're trialing out at the moment. Yeah. And it's interesting because where I am in Devon, like it's all over. E-scooters are illegal. Like you're not allowed to have them and stuff. And so it was really interesting to then go to a city where they were everywhere, just people all over the city on them. Like, and I thought that's pretty cool that they are trialing, and they seem to be being taken up by a lot of people. A lot of people are using these as an alternative to their bus or their car or whatever. Although I did spend quite a long time trying to calculate it, because it's something like £1 to hire it and then 20p a minute. So I was thinking, well, how long would it take to scoot from there to there? So how much would that cost? But it's still cool that they're trialing it in some areas at least. But
and I think that's yet again another really good example of, do we have this sort of like joined up approach across the entire country that can start to make a difference? And we don't. We allow certain places, certain cities to do it. Yeah. We've most probably all experienced being in this country, and it's like, right, okay, what day does my bin go out? Well, that's difficult enough for some people, let alone what things go in what bins. And that the glass gets collected here, but not from over there. And we have food waste done, but not this. So everybody has sort of like a slightly different approach to it.
Yeah. But when you get to a point where you have I think those things like the e-scooters or e-bikes or whatever we have them in Durham here in North Carolina too. The interesting part for me is how when you get to a certain level of adoption, whether that starts to then get infrastructure changes, right? Because you've just got like idiots on e-scooters in the middle of the road, right? Then the motorists start demanding that you have separate bike lanes. Yeah. And then suddenly biking becomes more pleasant. And it turns out it's just a much nicer way to get around. And then you look at somewhere like Amsterdam, where it's just the norm. And you don't have to give a hoot about climate change to know that it's going to be much faster to get from, Central Station to Leidseplein or whatever on your bicycle than it is to either take a tram or, heaven forbid, get in a car. Who would want to drive in Amsterdam? So there are these like tipping points that you're going to get to. And if you can find those pressure points to get to tipping points, that's where you put your energy. And I think things can transform really quickly. I mean, I haven't been to Paris since the mayor, I forget her name, Mayor Hidalgo came in, I think. But I see videos all the time of like Paris does not look like it did last time I was there. Parisian traffic was awful, and now there's just bikes everywhere. And actually, last time I was in London, it was much better than it used to be. Same with Bristol.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be interested to know what your guys' thoughts are on these kind of solutions for more rural communities. Because when you were saying earlier about being scared to cycle, like same where I am, like they're trying to build more cycle paths to join up all the towns in the countryside, but I still wouldn't feel comfortable like on some of the roads, like 60-mile-an-hour roads, which have got cyclists and blind corners and cars everywhere and stuff. But I don't know, like obviously this is fairly theoretical and not really, but I don't know what kind of solutions do you think they can have for rural areas for kind of green transport?
I suppose just to pitch in, I'd say that we most probably haven't even fully explored all our low-hanging fruit in our urban areas.
Yeah.
And so if we're talking about sort of just generally making a difference, I think that's where you're going to sort of like concentrate. Rural areas are always, being difficult to connect. But one of the issues that we've sort of like self-generated is we've allowed people, it's now going back to Sami's idea of norms. It's quite normal to have a place of work that's say 30 miles away from the place that you live.
Yeah.
And I'd say ultimately that's part of the disconnect, because we now have rural areas that don't have that same community based around the work that is in that area. What we have is we have lifestyle choices where people are having that, much larger garden, that semi-detached or detached house, or this lovely little straw, topped cottage. Yet they work, in a financial institution, and their commute could possibly be an hour each way, and that seemed to be normal.
Yeah.
So
yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting how those norms, like that. It's a little bit hard to predict how things like increased working from home is going to influence that. Like everyone says, oh, it's going to reduce emissions. It's going to reduce emissions. But if it means everyone in Bristol moves to, somewhere in South Wales, guess what? Even if you're driving in once a week, it turns out the emissions are roughly the same. It would be interesting to look at, like, and I don't know enough about British planning laws or sort of road management. Here we have a real difference between cities owning some roads and the federal government being responsible for others, and it's very, very hard to get joined up infrastructure. I go to Finland. My mother is from Finland. You go to Finland, and her family live in a very rural part of Finland, and there is a separated bike lane all the way from the large metropolis of Ojakkala, which has like 2,000 people living in it, to the even larger metropolis of Nummela, which is like 7,000 people or whatever, and there is a separated bike lane all the way, right? But they have the benefit of one, probably a more functional government, two, some level of sort of social, the idea that the government has a place in recreating how you move around. And so culturally there's benefit, and also there's just lower population. There's more room to spread out. Yeah. That's actually what drives me nuts about the States, because so there's so much room. It actually looks a lot like rural Finland around here in North Carolina. And really all of our big sort of not the freeways, but the sort of rural highways, the main roads, the A roads, if you like, there's room on all of them to have like a separated bike lane all the way, and it wouldn't cost very much. But there's no, there is no political will for it. Yeah. The only people in the rural communities who don't drive are poor and often, marginalized communities, right? Black, Indigenous, Hispanic, and they don't have the political power to demand that, So there's a real sort of impasse that we get to.
I suppose for us, one of the big things is if you wanted to go down that route, we're lucky and fortunate enough to have good organisations such as Sustrans around, which are actively trying to open up cycle networks and routeways. And if we, it's another one of these things that if back in sort of like the 1960s, when, Mr. Beeching came along and closed down all the railways and all the branch lines, if we hadn't just committed such an act of vandalism by blowing up all the bridges and ripping up all the tracks and then allowing houses to be built across them, we would have this lovely, flat, beautiful, interconnecting route between all of these towns and villages that were at that time, I suppose, medium to small, but would now be of a more significant size. We would already have that network.
Yeah.
Right.
We sort of kicked up. We did a bit of self-harm on that.
Yeah.
But you'd hope that, I think that's where the sort of like the support and the development's going to come through, most probably from an organisation such as Sustrans or others that are trying to open up those networks. But again, it's down to, I suppose, an organization has that is lucky that it not only can get and will receive government support and local authority support as well, but we can all be personal members of it too. So, if everyone is a member and they get money through legacies or other donations, they can see sort of big changes. And, I don't know if you've been down the alongside the River Exe between Exmouth and Powdrim, all of that has been pretty much done by Sustrans.
Well, I was in Topsham, and I think I was there when they opened the last connecting bridges so that you could get from Exmouth to Exeter all along the coast path.
So you're seeing it, but it's just a long, slow change, because this is sort of like very, very expensive infrastructure and sort of doing deals with individual land managers and owners, and then you've got the world of planning. So it's just a long, slow process. But I suppose ultimately for rural areas, which is back to what it was about, it's going to be some of these organisations that are going to deliver it, or it's going to be a big structural change again.
And Sustrans has always been, I remember when they, back in the day, it was the Bristol Bath cycle path, and they talked this good game of, like they're going to connect all these communities across England. You'd look at it and go like, really?
Maybe do that.
And it turns out they can. It's just, it is a 10, 20, 30 year process, that's and there is work like that being done in the States too. Like we're seeing it. It's very disjointed. The challenge is that unless you can make those connections, it's the last mile. Like I can bike to my place of work, which is about 10 miles away, and I talk about it in the book a little bit. So I can get 80% there on an old railway line bike path, right? And then the last 2 miles, I've done it once, and it was the most terrifying experience of my life, and I nearly died. I've never done it again, and I won't do it until they fix that, right? Because I'm not going to kill myself on a futile mission to promote cycling. Because it turns out that dead cyclists don't promote cycling very well.
They're not very good at holding placards, are they?
No.
I mean, that's part of the reason I don't go to the office very often, because when I started working with our company, it was much, much closer to where I live now, and now it's very far away, and it's a guilt thing. I always feel guilty, which leads me to talk a little bit about guilt, because I part of my thoughts behind that question was just, I have so much guilt about living rurally, and then the fact that I rely on the car so heavily. I'd love to talk to you guys about your experiences of feeling guilty, why it's maybe not so helpful, and what we can kind of do about it. And I think you talk about encouraging imperfection, Sami, which is something I love as someone who's very, very far from perfect.
Yeah, that's 100% my brand.
So I'll share that with you.
So no, the way I come at it. So when I started writing We're All Climate Hypocrites Now, the idea was to get rid of this idea of guilt, right? I thought it was going to be a thing that assuaged my guilt, or said, you don't need to feel guilty because it's the system. It's the 100 companies responsible for 80% of emissions and all of this. And where I landed is a little bit more nuanced.
Okay.
Is that actually, so I think there's a place for guilt, right? I feel guilty about all kinds of things. I feel guilty that there are people who are homeless in my city, right? I feel guilty about the fact that, racism exists. I feel guilty about the fact that, I'm still burning oil to get around occasionally, or because I fly. I don't think that guilt is bad. I think it's a signal that something is wrong, and you can listen to it and you can seek change. Guilt is a social regulator. So as long as the guilt doesn't become debilitating, I think it can be a really useful signal that I should do something about it. Where I think guilt becomes a problem is that we make a leap from, I feel guilty about climate change and my contribution to climate change, to therefore it is all my fault, as opposed to therefore I have opportunities and responsibilities to do something about it. And it doesn't necessarily follow that the most important thing I should do is to focus on my own impact, right? Actually, the most important thing I should do is find my superpower, which Pete alluded to, which is like find my place to have an influence. If I'm a member of a church or a mosque or whatever, maybe that's the place that I put my effort into shifting the system, right? Maybe it's political activism. Maybe it's reducing my carbon footprint to zero. But if I do that, then how do I broadcast that outwards? Otherwise, it's just an exercise in sort of absolution rather than, sort of absolution rather than finding solutions is a slogan for you.
I thought you were going to say evangelism there, absolution rather than
Oh,
evangelism.
right. That has way too much baggage for me to discuss when I'm living here in the Bible Belt. So.
I meant strictly in the non-religious sense.
But yeah, I think there's a place for guilt, but some people find it crippling, and they find it. I think it's a good spur to action. It's rarely a very good guide to what you should actually do about it. And actually, racism is a useful analogy here. I think is that it's very healthy for people who have benefited from white supremacy to wait, do you say supremacy? I'm not sure. But people who've benefited from white supremacy to feel guilty about it. I think that's perfectly fine and normal, because we probably should. As someone who grew up in Bristol, right, who, you know, there's a lot of slave money there, and I'm now living at the other end of the slave triangle. The urge to feel guilty is great. The trouble is when you let that guilt guide your actions, it becomes performative and it becomes somewhat useless. And you know, it turns into these, you know, let me put a bumper sticker on my car saying how bad racism is. But that doesn't do anything, right? Instead, I should be looking at, like, okay, where are my opportunities to reset inequities at my workplace, or to engage with and allow marginalized communities to lead the environmental movement, right? Like, how can I listen and shut the heck up rather than trying to prove that I'm not a racist? And I think climate change is very much the same thing. Like, it can become very performative if we lean into our guilt and sort of say, like, oh, I've got to go and grow my own radishes and live in the woods and just find a yurt somewhere. That's not a scalable solution, right? And I'm not gonna demand that everyone else does that either. It's fine if you want to. Like, I think there's great things done by people who are living that low impact lifestyle, but it often becomes this effort to say, well, now I'm not part of the problem. It's like, guess what? You not being part of the problem is neither here nor there in terms of actually solving the problem. So it's much more important to allow the guilt to be a spur and then move on, and then, you know, relax a little bit too.
Yeah, I think when it becomes quite debilitating, then it causes inaction, doesn't it?
Yep.
If you sort of going to take you can feel guilty without it all being completely your responsibility. And it's funny how it manifests in some people. So I can remember hearing before about some UK journalist who was basically saying that, you know, because of climate change and because of sort of the impact that everybody has, that they were not going to have any children, because they didn't want to bring children, not because it was the effect that that might have upon those children, but it was about the effect that those children might have upon the planet. Yeah. And I was just thinking, wow, that's just such a really sad way to look at it. Yeah. And for myself, I sort of like think to myself, well, you know, I've got 2 children. I actually think that having children is really good, because what we need is the right children out there that are going to make these changes. So there's another way that you can look at it. You can look at this as, you know, having too many people, that's part of the problem. And it's like, well, or is it that we don't have the right people? Yeah. You know, so that's sort of part of my sort of like thing, and you know, is to sort of like make sure that the 2 little people that I'm responsible for are going to go off and do great and wonderful things, and you know, hopefully the 2 of them will be able to do more than the 1 of me.
Yeah. I think that's spot on. Is that it's nobody's business whether you have children or not, other than you and your significant other or others, right? Like, that's like the only people who really have a right to have that conversation. And the thing with when we lean into our own guilt is that it often then manifests in that sort of like everyone's pointing fingers at each other, because the vegan's yelling at the meat eater, and the meat eater is yelling at the vegan because the vegan got on a plane to go to their vegan convention, right? Or whatever it is, right? And it becomes like this sort of circular firing squad. Yeah. Whereas actually, you know, any time spent pointing fingers at other individuals for individual transgressions, beyond maybe like the really egregious stuff, right? If you're flying around in a private jet, you probably should feel pretty guilty and do something about it.
Fire to oil fields, that sort of stuff.
Yeah. Right. But and actually this is another sort of related aspect. If you're talking about guilt, you also have to talk about shame, which is a separate emotion and a separate social function. So shame and shaming are really, really useful. They're really, really useful tools within the environmental movement, but they become, as I spoke to, I think she's at New York University professor, Jennifer Jackway. She wrote a book called Is Shame Necessary? and it's a terrific book on the use of shame within the environmental movement. And her argument is that shame and shaming are like antibiotics. That they're very, very powerful tools, but the more you use them, the more you dilute their power. So if we are shaming each other for all these little transgressions, whatever those might be, I'm shaming you, Hannah, because you live in the countryside and you drive to the office, or you're shaming me because I fly home to see my mom. It turns out that what we're doing collectively is we are absolving, the head of BP who came up with that carbon footprint ad back in the day, right? Or Ben Van Beurden at Shell, who thinks planting a bunch of trees is going to be, his path to net zero. And that's where we need the shame, right? So it's very, very important that we move from, it's okay to feel guilty, but if you're feeling ashamed or you are shaming somebody, then unless you've got real reason to do so, I urge people to kind of like put that aside, and time spent shaming each other is time not spent shaming Liz Truss or Donald Trump or Joe Manchin.
I don't know if I can quite get on board with that, but what I would say is that sort of like for some of this sort of stuff, I found this when I ran the management system at the zoo, is I got pulled to one side one day by my auditor, who said, right, you're doing a really good job at everything that you're highlighting all your impacts, but you're just concentrating on all the negative stuff. You're beating yourself up for all the stuff that you're not doing properly, but you're not congratulating yourself for all the sort of like the positive things that you're doing as an organization, because you're making net benefits, because you fund reserves overseas, or you're bringing forward this species, or you've got these outreach projects. And I think quite often as the environmental movement, it can quite often foster these or concentrate on these negative emotions around shame and guilt, where as a child, I've always found it a lot better to be sort of given sort of like those positive messages, or led along with a direction, rather than just being shouted at for not doing that thing. It was always much better for me to be led in a direction. And I think that's sometimes the problem that happens, is that we do use, the government sometimes classically will do sort of like adverts around climate change showing how horrible it is. And I do remember one before, there was a little girl that was being read a story time by her dad, in an advert, and all the animals were drowning because of sea level. And it's like, this is horrific. This isn't fun. This isn't buoying me up in a positive way to make a difference. This is just making me feel awful. So I just want to crawl around in a cave and not engage. So.
I mean that's really what I think we're actually on the same page on that, Pete, is that I think the shame has to be kept in reserve for when it's really useful, right? So the example I'd give is that here in the States, I'm involved with a group called Dogwood Alliance, which is a forest protection organization based in the South. We're trying to protect southern forests. We've been working a lot on the biomass issue, hence my reference to UK use of biomass energy. And back in the day, we did a campaign against Kentucky Fried Chicken for their packaging policies, right? They were using unsustainably sourced paper and pulp. And we went through all these sort of intellectual arguments why they shouldn't be doing that. We had these very sort of cerebral campaigns. And then at some point, we were just like, well, what if we just put a chainsaw in the Colonel Sanders' hands and make him look like a mean guy? Yeah. And we just shamed. It was just full on shaming. And within a couple of months, they had changed their paper and packaging policies, right? And that resulted in a change to how International Pulp and Paper managed forests across the entire Southeast United States, right? So it's this really, really powerful tool, but it's just misdirected all the time. And the misdirection isn't just useless; it's actively counterproductive, right? Because you're stopping, you're disarming yourself.
I have to give that note to my 10-year-old who has made a poster about climate change and put it in our window that says, "Save the planet, it's yours too," which is quite shaming to all our neighbours that walk past.
Is that shaming or is that just a statement of fact?
I quite like that. It comes better from a 10-year-old though.
Yeah,
right?
There's 3 angry posters all about saving the world on our kitchen window. It does get a lot of eyes as we walk past. This kind of leads me quite nicely to my last bit. So in lockdown, I home educate, and I'd found this kind of project through a company called Thoughtbox Education, who are a really cool company, and it was all about climate change and for kids, and it was like aimed at kids. and I think it was 6 weeks, and we did the first 2 weeks, and by the end of the second week, my kids, honestly, they just looked like, despair. They were just like, Mum, this is awful, it's awful. And I thought, oh my gosh, I'll look ahead to the next week. And then the second half was all about, okay, we've told you what's so crap, but now we're going to tell you like loads of examples about people doing amazing things around the world to try and counter that. So I figured we'll do the same thing here and try and finish on something positive and uplifting, because it's really easy just to feel really sad and hopeless when you talk about this kind of stuff. So I'd love to hear some positive stories from you guys, either just from your past or experience, or businesses that are making waves, or just suggestions for people listening, how we can kind of do something productive, and just something nice and positive on the subject to finish off, if that's all right with you guys.
Sure. Pete, you want to go first or shall I?
No, you go for it, because we need more time to think.
Okay. So, I mean, one of the big things that I think is a super positive is how widespread the climate movement is becoming. I particularly see this in the States, right? In terms of, I think there is a perception that environmentalism is a white middle class concern. And it not only is it not, it never has been, right? Actually, a lot of the most powerful environmental movements have been super broad-based, often, have come out of marginalized communities. And I think there's this really powerful climate justice movement that is building and is pushing back so hard on fossil fuels and on extractive industries. And I expect to see it continue to grow. I think we lost a little bit of momentum during the pandemic. There was huge marches happening over here and really big shifts. But that movement is directly responsible for this legislation that I was alluding to earlier. And not just the fact that we passed legislation on renewable energy, and on electric vehicles, but we did so with some pretty significant environmental justice provisions, right? And I think that's where I see real hope, is that I'm not particularly interested in just shifting society from one form of energy to another and solving like the climate crisis, right? Like, it would be great if we could, right? If we just sort of tomorrow we woke up and everything was running on wind and solar, but it turns out we'd still have all these other problems. Where I take real hope is that if you come at these problems not from a simple modal shift, right? I'm going to shift you from sorry, that's not a modal shift. I'm using the wrong terminology. Pete's smarter than I am on that stuff. But rather than shifting you from a Hummer to a Tesla, right? You shift onto an e-bike, and suddenly you've solved road traffic safety problems. You've solved, the disconnect between particularly marginalized communities in cities, where they're often, here at least, they've built highways. Always they go through the Black community, right? There's just a classic history of that. It was always the poor and the marginalized and those without power. They get all the polluting infrastructure. So that's where I take real hope. I think there's massive progress being made, and there is power being built that looks at this not just from a energy and engineering standpoint, but from a social benefit standpoint, right? It turns out that a walkable, bikeable, a disabled access community is better for everybody. It's just nicer to live in, right? You ride a bike, you feel like a child again. And that to me is where like I take that joy of like we have so many opportunities to just make stuff better and more fun.
Yeah.
That's my why, man.
How about you, Pete?
So I'm not going to pick on any one specific thing, but I'd sort of say that, as a person that's now in his late 40s, and you sort of see the change. I said at the beginning, sort of like the change of myself from being sort of, back in the day, a bit of a petrol head who, just didn't really give, any real concern to it, that has changed. And I start to think, it's becoming, less of a, it stopped being like a movement to becoming a norm.
Yeah.
And part of the point was, before being an environmental person, for an organization, was to try and get to the point where you basically get rid of your own job, which sounds really peculiar, but that everything is totally being done when you're no longer needed. We're nowhere near there yet, but just the changes, you can start to see it happening. In the news recently, I think they were Mr. Mogg has been sort of saying that he wants to open up fracking, but yet one of the Conservative people who are an MP in that area have already turned around and started shooting him down and saying that it's outrageous. Imagine somebody in the Conservative Party sort of openly attacking somebody else in the Conservative Party. It was sort of, quite eye-opening to me. So I'm starting to see that it's just becoming sort of like it's just becoming the norm. And when it becomes the norm, it means that sort of like that moral argument or that intellectual argument is sort of, it's won, it's done, and this is just how we do it. And I think that's what I'm starting to feel, that we're getting in that direction. And as terrible as it sounds, the issues that we're having around prices, how many people are now suddenly thinking about energy efficiency in this country? I mean, obviously you've got Mr. Bonehead turning around and saying to us before that we should all buy a kettle to save on our electricity costs, which is just, but what else are you going to get from Boris Johnson? But the fact that somebody was saying about it, whereas before he was saying that everybody that was involved in sort of like environmentalness or energy reduction was just crackpots, to actually saying that himself. It's and trying to find, at the moment, you try to find a PV installer anywhere around here. Good luck. I tried to get my somebody to look at fixing our wood burner in our house next year. So all these things are in demand, and this is about growing this green economy and green community, and I feel like we're starting to get there. And it's through a crisis that it happens. And unfortunately, we're having our crisis now. I think we're starting to see some positive results as an effect.
Well, I think what you're alluding to is the fact that the old system didn't work very well, right? And now we're hitting the real barriers of like
the thing is, it worked beautifully. It provided sort of like cheap energy, but it was all the externalities that weren't included. It's like, you can have cheap electricity, but you're going to have air pollution, and you're going to have this, and you're going to have some waste, and don't forget about So it did what it was supposed to do. It's just that now we want something better, and we demand it.
That's fair, And I will offer one final actual concrete thing that is worth checking out in terms of hope. I don't know if you all followed what Patagonia did recently.
Really exciting.
So I can never pronounce it. Yves Chouinard, I think, the founder of Patagonia, just turned around and basically gave away his entire company. Right? He has. I don't know the details of it beyond that. They looked at selling. They looked at all of this, and actually they've handed all shares to the Patagonia Foundation, and all profits will go back into climate work, and specifically climate justice work, which is interesting to me. Is that it's not just a lot of corporate giving within the climate space is like, we'll plant trees, we'll plant trees, we'll plant trees. It's all this uncontroversial stuff. Patagonia gives money to like frontline indigenous communities fighting oil extraction. Right. They give money to the communities in the South that are fighting the biomass industry. Right. They give money in places where it's like, this isn't just about sort of a nice, simple, non-political solution. We don't get to have that. Right. This is inherently political, and it involves a fight. And it's nice to see people with billions of dollars realizing it and giving those billions of dollars away. Right. That's kind of exciting to me. I think there's real potential. I hope to see more.
I mean, obviously, the other really exciting thing is there's this amazing book out which is called All Climate Hypocrites Now, Embracing Our Limitations, Unlock the Power of a Movement, available in paperback from lots of good publishers, and also terrible ones too, most probably.
Pay their tax, please.
Yeah, that's right. Yes. All independent bookstores and that other place.
Good plug, Pete.
Thank you, Pete. That was good. I couldn't do that myself because I'm self-deprecating. So I appreciate it. I'll buy you a pint of scrumpy next time I see you.
Yay!
So I'll very, very quickly finish by asking quickly 3 quick fire questions. So I don't know who wants to go first. But the first one's, how do you relax?
How do I relax?
Read.
Sleep. Yeah, naps. Naps is my relaxation.
Power naps.
That's the same for you, Pete.
Oh, well, I said naps. So other than that,
I'm feeling that too. Yeah.
I think just sort of getting in a semi-comatose state is the way to go forward.
Love it. No one's ever said that before. And what are you reading or listening to right now? So music, books, podcasts, anything particularly great? Obviously, we're all climate hypocrites now. Top of Pete's list.
reading and rereading. What I'm listening to right now is last night I walked to a dive bar and I listened to the first 2 tracks on Björk's new album, and it was terrific. Like utterly bonkers, but really fun. It was like a mix of like Dutch gabber and oboe. Like I was like, what is she doing? Love it.
And Pete, what about you?
Well, so I just listen to quite a lot of Six music, so I just pick up a whole smorgasbord of lots of different bits and pieces. So I quite like the song called Edge of the Edge by Panda Bear and Sonic Boom, which has been out quite a bit. That's a recommendation. And book-wise, I'm reading Bob Mortimer's autobiography, which I love. It's absolutely brilliant. It's top. It's fantastic.
Awesome.
It's like he's in the room with you.
I will add one more listen. If you want something more climate specific, I highly recommend. I don't know how well known they are over on that side of the pond, but Hot Take is a great podcast looking at climate and climate justice stuff. It is produced by friends of mine, but it's a really terrific look at not just climate from the political side, but also they look a lot at climate communications, climate writing. Really worth checking out.
Awesome. And finally, I know that outdoors is important to you guys, but why?
It's always been there for me.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? If I've been having a bad day, then it's there, and just sort of I'm having a bad day outdoors, and I go out there, and it's not judgy. It's sometimes quite quiet, but if it's noisy, it's nicely noisy. It sort of seems to, sometimes you say, oh well, you should put this record on because it's good if you're feeling sad, or it's like outdoors just always seems to have the right tune.
Yeah.
Yeah. Otherwise we'd be indoors all the time, wouldn't we? You got to have an outdoors. So one of the things I really enjoy here, particularly, is that I've lived here for 16 years now, and I'm still kind of like, what is that? Right? Like I walk out. I actually own a little bit of woodland, and spend some time out there, and there's hummingbirds that will just be down by the creek, right? And I'm like, that's an amazing privilege to be able to sit by yourself in some woods and watch a hummingbird feeding on a cardinal flower. Like there's nothing more beautiful than that, I think. Particularly if you have a cold beer. It's just a very, very relaxing thing, and I think they might actually be fairies. I'm not sure, but it's very cool. So there's a magic there that's really fun, and often when we talk about the magic of the outdoors, I think it often sounds quite woo-woo, right? And it sounds sort of a bit like sort of hippy-dippy or whatever, and it's not. I think everyone I know, right, regardless of politics or political leanings or sort of personality, you get something from just being in a space around nature. Right. Some of us like to get more stuck in. Some of us are a bit grossed out by bugs and all of that stuff. But I think everyone gets something out of just sitting near water.
It's
right?
a leveler, isn't
near
it?
a tree. Yeah, it's good.
It's good. Good conclusion, guys. No, that was awesome. Thank you so much for your time today, guys. I know you're both very busy people.
Yeah, it was fun.
Pleasure.
Nice to talk to you both.
Yeah, nice to meet you, Sami. A big thank you again to Sami and to Pete for joining me for that conversation. I really enjoyed it. It was particularly nice to be in the presence of 2 old friends, and I hope that you guys enjoyed listening to it as well. As always, we'd love it if you would like the podcast, subscribe to it, rate it, share it with all your friends, do all the things that you're meant to do with podcasts, just so that more people can find us. We'd be so grateful. Thanks for listening again, and we'll see you again in 2 weeks' time.